Welcome back to the channel, and if this is your first time here, welcome to True Event Archive, where history is not just told, it is experienced. This is a place for those who understand that the past is alive. That behind every date and every war, there were real people breathing, fearing, hoping, and sometimes freezing. Tonight's story is not about a famous battle. There are no dramatic cavalry charges, no triumphant speeches, no flags raised in victory. This is the story of a retreat, a march, a slow, relentless collapse into one of the harshest environments on Earth. This is the story of the frozen march that killed thousands. And once you understand what happened, you may never look at winter the same way again. The men began walking before dawn. The sky was pale and colorless, as if even the sun had abandoned them. Breath crystallized in front of their faces. Eyelashes clumped together in ice. Wool uniforms, once protective, stiffened into frozen armor. At first, the cold was uncomfortable. Then it became painful. Then it became something else entirely, a living force pressing against the human body. Somewhere behind them, the enemy advanced. But the enemy they could not escape was already here. The temperature had fallen below -40 degrees Celsius. Metal burned skin on contact. Rifles jammed. Fingers lost sensation within minutes. And ahead of them stretched thousands of miles of frozen Siberian wilderness. To understand how thousands of soldiers and civilians ended up marching into that white abyss, we must step back to a nation tearing itself apart. The year was 1919. The Russian Empire had already collapsed under the weight of revolution. The Tsar was gone, the monarchy executed, and in its place, chaos spread like wildfire. The Bolsheviks, led by revolutionary leaders determined to reshape society, had seized control of major cities. But Russia was vast, and not everyone accepted the new regime. Opposition forces, loosely united under what became known as the White Army, fought desperately to reclaim power. It was not a clean war. It was not organized neatly into clear battle lines. It was civil war in its rawest form. Neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, entire regions choosing sides and then switching them. In Siberia, far from the political centers of Moscow and Petrograd, the White forces had established a fragile foothold. But fragility does not survive long in civil war. Admiral Alexander Kolchak declared himself the supreme ruler of Russia in Siberia. For a time, his forces held territory. They believed they could push westward and crush the Bolsheviks. But overconfidence is a dangerous companion in war. By mid-1919, Bolshevik counteroffensives began breaking through white defenses. Cities fell, supply routes collapsed, troops retreated in disorder, and what had once seemed like a strategic repositioning became a desperate withdrawal. But withdrawing in European Russia is one thing. Withdrawing in Siberia during winter is something else entirely. Siberia is not simply cold, it is enormous beyond imagination. It stretches across forests, tundra, frozen rivers, and open plains that seem to have no end. In summer, it is harsh. In winter, it is merciless. Temperatures plummet far below freezing. Blizzards appear without warning. The landscape becomes monochrome: white snow, gray sky, dark tree lines. Navigation becomes guesswork. Distance becomes distortion. Hope becomes fragile. And in 1919, thousands of soldiers and civilians were about to march into it. The Trans-Siberian Railway was the lifeline. It was the only artery capable of moving large numbers across that endless expanse. But it was overwhelmed. Damaged tracks, limited coal supplies, too many refugees. not enough locomotives. As the White Army retreated eastward, civilians flooded the railway. Officials, families, merchants, political allies, anyone fearing Bolshevik retribution fled alongside the army. What began as a military maneuver became a mass human migration. And winter did not care whether you wore a uniform. At first, the retreat appeared organized. Units marched in columns. Officers issued commands. Supply wagons creaked behind horses whose breath turned to steam in the air. But winter tightens its grip gradually. The first sign was numbness, then frostbite, then equipment failure. Boots cracked from repeated freezing and thawing. Men wrapped their feet in rags. Some tore fabric from dead comrades to insulate their own hands. Because in Siberia, exposed skin could freeze in minutes. And once tissue dies, it does not return. The cold did something else, too. It slowed thought. It dulled reaction. Men began making mistakes they never would have made in warmer climates. Forgetting to cover ears, removing gloves too long while adjusting weapons, sitting down to rest, just for a moment. That moment often became permanent. Because when the body temperature drops low enough, the urge to sleep becomes overwhelming. And sleep in that cold was death. Eyewitnesses later described the silence. Snow absorbs sound. Even thousands of boots crunching across ice felt muted. The world became smaller, more isolated. The line of marching figures stretched ahead and behind, disappearing into white haze. When someone stumbled and fell, there was rarely shouting. No dramatic cries, just a shape collapsing into snow. Sometimes they rose again, sometimes they did not. And the column kept moving, because stopping meant sharing their fate. Food shortages worsened the suffering. Supply trains failed to reach certain divisions. Rations were cut repeatedly. First meat, then bread, then anything remotely substantial. Horses weakened quickly, and when horses collapsed, they were butchered. Frozen meat was hacked apart with numb hands, eaten half raw, chewed until jaws ached, but even that did not last. Soon there were no horses left to slaughter. Only men, still marching. Disease crept silently into the ranks. Typhus spread rapidly in overcrowded railcars and tightly packed marching groups. Weakened immune systems could not resist infection. Fever burned through bodies already struggling against cold. Delirious soldiers wandered off the road into snowstorms. They were swallowed by white nothingness. And no one could afford to search for them. Leadership began to fracture under pressure. Rumors circulated that certain commanders had secured heated train cars for themselves while common soldiers marched. Whether entirely true or exaggerated, perception alone eroded trust. Discipline in retreat is fragile. Once doubt spreads, cohesion shatters. Units separated. Some marched too quickly and lost contact. Others lagged and became isolated targets for Bolshevik pursuers. The army was dissolving, not from bullets, but from exhaustion and mistrust. Blizzards struck without warning. Visibility dropped to mere meters. Men tied themselves together with rope to avoid losing one another. But ropes snap, hands numb. And sometimes entire segments vanished into the storm. Snow does not record history. It covers it. Some divisions reached train stations hoping for transport. But railcars were already overcrowded. Coal supplies ran low. Engines froze in place. There are accounts of trains discovered days later, their passengers frozen inside, sitting upright as if merely asleep. Winter had entered even the machinery of escape. By the time segments of the retreat reached Irkutsk, thousands were gone. Not killed in glorious combat. Not executed in dramatic final stands. But frozen, starved, lost, and this was only the beginning, because the march would continue, and the worst was still ahead. By late December of 1919, the retreat had stopped resembling an army. It had become something far more fragile, a moving fracture across the Siberian landscape. Columns that once marched in formation were now scattered across frozen roads, railway embankments, and forests stripped bare by winter. Civilians trudged alongside soldiers. Children wrapped in blankets rode on sleds pulled by skeletal horses. Elderly officials leaned on walking sticks that sank into snow with every step. And always, the cold. It was no longer an environment. It was a presence. It seeped through boots and into bone. It entered lungs like knives. It turned breath into frost that crusted beards and scarves into stiff masks. Men stopped speaking unless necessary. Conversation required energy. Energy required food. Food was nearly gone. The supply crisis deepened with terrifying speed. Warehouses that commanders believed held rations were found empty, looted by fleeing officials or destroyed during earlier chaos. Railway depots that should have contained coal had none left. Engines stalled on tracks that disappeared beneath snowdrifts. There are records of entire units standing for hours beside silent locomotives, staring at the metal beasts that promised escape but refused to move. When coal ran out, soldiers dismantled wooden fences and abandoned structures to burn inside train boilers. It was never enough. Trains crept forward for miles, then froze again. Each delay meant more frostbite, more illness, more despair, and behind them, Bolshevik forces tightened the noose. The retreat now stretched for hundreds of miles. Communication between units collapsed almost entirely. Telegraph lines had been cut or destroyed. Couriers disappeared in storms. Orders issued in one town reached another days too late, if they arrived at all. Commanders began making decisions based on rumor. Some believed reinforcements were coming from the east. Others believed the Japanese, who had forces in parts of Siberia at the time, might intervene. Most of those hopes were illusions. The reality was far simpler. They were alone. Typhus tore through overcrowded train cars like fire through dry timber. Lice thrived in unwashed uniforms layered for warmth. Feverish men shivered uncontrollably, then burned with heat even as frost formed on the walls around them. Medical supplies were exhausted quickly. Doctors amputated frostbitten fingers with dull instruments heated over candles. There was no anesthesia left. The screams echoed briefly in railcars before fading into the steady hum of wind outside. Sometimes, the sick were removed from trains to prevent infection from spreading further. Removed meant left behind, on frozen platforms, under open sky. There are accounts of physicians writing notes and pinning them to coats, small messages identifying the dead so families might someday know their fate. Most of those notes were buried beneath snow within hours. Starvation changed people. At first, hunger was an ache. Then it became a constant companion. Then it became an obsession. Soldiers began searching abandoned villages for grain stores. Often they found nothing but frozen wells and boarded windows. When they did find food, discipline broke instantly. There are testimonies describing bread loaves ripped apart by dozens of hands at once. Fights breaking out over handfuls of flour. In one village, retreating soldiers slaughtered livestock meant to sustain civilians through winter. That decision may have saved some soldiers for days. It doomed entire communities for months. War spread suffering outward like ripples in ice. The psychological toll was perhaps the most devastating of all. Cold and hunger erode the body, but uncertainty erodes the mind. No one knew how far they still had to go. Distances in Siberia are deceptive. A line of trees on the horizon might take hours to reach. A station marked on a map might no longer exist. Men began to detach emotionally. They marched automatically, eyes down, step after step. Survivors later described entering a kind of waking dream, where time blurred and memory fractured. Some spoke of hearing voices carried on the wind. Others claimed to see lights in forests at night that vanished when approached. Extreme cold can induce hallucinations. The brain, deprived of warmth and nutrition, begins to misfire. And in those endless white expanses, imagination could become terrifyingly real. Blizzards intensified in January. One storm reportedly lasted 3 consecutive days. Snow buried supply wagons entirely. Men woke to find their boots frozen solid. Several units attempted to dig trenches for shelter, but frozen ground resisted like stone. The wind howled so violently it seemed to flatten the landscape itself. During that storm, entire detachments disappeared. When the sky cleared, scattered bodies were discovered half buried, some only meters from the main road. They had simply stepped off course. In a whiteout, a few degrees of deviation becomes fatal. Meanwhile, leadership at the highest levels faltered. Admiral Alexander Kolchak, once confident and resolute, found his authority shrinking by the day. Political allies began abandoning him. Foreign powers that once supported the anti-Bolshevik cause reconsidered their involvement. Some officers questioned whether continuing the retreat was even meaningful. What were they retreating toward? Was there a strategic regrouping point? Or merely more snow? Internal disputes grew sharper. Accusations of corruption surfaced. It was alleged that certain officials had secured private transport while common soldiers froze. Whether entirely accurate or exaggerated by rumor, the damage was done. Trust, once broken, cannot survive long in crisis. And then came the river crossings. Frozen rivers were both highways and traps. The ice allowed rapid movement, when stable. But Siberian rivers are unpredictable. Currents flow beneath ice sheets. Thickness varies. Under the weight of hundreds marching together, cracks began to form. There are documented instances of entire carts plunging through weakened ice. Men scrambled to pull others out. But water at those temperatures does not grant second chances. Within minutes, soaked clothing froze solid. Those pulled from the river often died hours later from hypothermia. Some commanders ordered troops to cross in smaller groups. Others, pressed by urgency, risked larger crossings. Each decision carried lethal consequences. Civilians suffered equally, sometimes more. Families who had fled believing trains would carry them east now found themselves stranded between collapsing fronts. Mothers wrapped children in layers of fabric, then in curtains torn from abandoned houses. Infants cried weakly before falling silent. In overcrowded railcars, people took turns standing so others could sit. There were stories of strangers sharing their last pieces of bread with children not their own. Even in catastrophe, humanity flickered. But flickers are fragile against wind. By mid-January, morale had collapsed entirely in some units. Desertions increased. Small groups attempted to head south toward rumored safe zones. Few reached them. Siberia in winter does not reward improvisation. It punishes it. Meanwhile, Bolshevik forces steadily reclaimed territory. They did not need to engage in massive battles. Winter was doing the work. When they encountered retreating white forces, resistance was often minimal. Many soldiers were too weak to fight. Some surrendered willingly, preferring captivity over freezing wilderness. The retreat now had a name whispered among survivors: the Great Siberian Ice March. But unlike other historic, ice marches, there was no unified heroic narrative forming. Only exhaustion, only survival, only the question, who would still be alive when the snow melted? In the city of Irkutsk, political tensions reached a boiling point. Local authorities, weary of chaos and shifting loyalties, began negotiating separately. Kolchak's power eroded rapidly. Within weeks, he would be arrested by factions that once supported him. The man who had declared himself supreme ruler of Russia was becoming a bargaining chip in a collapsing conflict. But for the thousands still on frozen roads, politics felt distant. Their world was immediate: snow, hunger, wind. Another step forward. Some survivors later recalled a strange moment when temperatures briefly rose. Not warm, but less deadly. The change felt almost miraculous. Snow softened slightly under boots. Breath did not sting as sharply. Men dared to believe the worst might be over. But Siberian winter is deceptive. The reprieve lasted only days. Then the cold returned with greater force, as if offended by hope. Mass graves began appearing along sections of the route. Shallow trenches dug hurriedly, bodies placed side by side, coats still on, sometimes marked with wooden crosses. Often not. There was rarely time for ceremony. Survival left little room for mourning, and yet some soldiers insisted on brief prayers, on removing caps, on acknowledging the fallen, because if they stopped seeing the dead as human, they feared they themselves would become something less. By February 1920, what remained of the retreat was no longer an organized military movement. It was a scattering of survivors, fragments of regiments, civilian clusters. Isolated trains crawling eastward. Behind them lay thousands who would never rise from the snow. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, and, for many, capture. The Ice March was nearing its end, but its consequences were only beginning. In the next part, we will explore the fall and execution of Admiral Kolchak, what happened to the survivors once the march ended, how the Bolsheviks consolidated control, why this disaster faded from global memory, and the haunting legacy left buried beneath Siberian snow. History often remembers the victors. But sometimes the most powerful stories belong to those who simply tried to survive. By the time the last survivors trudged toward the eastern reaches of Siberia, the march had long ceased to resemble an army. Discipline was gone. Units were fragments of what they once were. Men no longer marched in formation, they shuffled. They stumbled. They collapsed. Frostbite had claimed fingers, toes, and, in some cases, entire limbs. Some men lost their feet entirely, wrapping bloody stumps in rags to keep walking. Hunger had hollowed faces beyond recognition. Typhus and dysentery consumed the weak. And yet, the march continued, because stopping meant almost certain death in the endless white. Civilians were equally battered. Children who had once clutched the hands of their parents now lay curled in blankets pulled over icy ground. Mothers whispered prayers into snowstorms that swallowed every sound. Families depended on one another in ways that revealed both the cruelty and resilience of humanity. Survival instincts overrode morality, yet compassion flickered in small acts: a shared scrap of bread, a blanket passed to a trembling child, a whispered reassurance that they would reach safety. Kolchak's leadership had entirely collapsed. The man who had declared himself supreme ruler of Russia was powerless to prevent the march from disintegrating. Political allies abandoned him. Foreign support evaporated. Within months, Kolchak would be captured, tried, and executed by the Bolsheviks, his ambitions crushed. But for the thousands on the roads and tracks, politics was meaningless. Winter, disease, hunger, and exhaustion were the only rulers. Orders meant nothing. Maps were often outdated or destroyed. Railways froze. Rivers cracked and swallowed entire carts. The environment, indifferent and absolute, dictated life and death. Some units reached small towns or temporary settlements, but relief was inconsistent. Food and medical aid was scarce. Soldiers were emaciated, covered in frostbite sores, and psychologically shattered. Survivors described wandering into settlements, almost zombie-like, as if the body moved automatically while the mind had abandoned hope. In letters and diaries later recovered, men recounted the terror of the silence. Snow absorbs sound. Even thousands of footsteps in a column felt muted. Conversations dwindled to grunts. Screams disappeared in wind gusts. Men could vanish into whiteouts, leaving companions paralyzed by indecision, follow the path or attempt to rescue the lost. Rescue was often impossible, and hesitation was deadly. The physical suffering was mirrored by psychological collapse. Sleep became a danger. Cold slowed the mind. Hunger sharpened obsessions. Hallucinations were common. Survivors reported seeing shapes that weren't there. Some imagined distant fires, wagons, or human forms in blizzards, only to find them vanish into snow and silence. The human brain, starved and frozen, created stories to survive, but these stories sometimes carried men into the deaths. History rarely tells these details. Military textbooks remember strategy and tactics. Soldiers are remembered for valor, but the frozen march was remembered for endurance, for the sheer impossibility of surviving. Thousands died, not in combat, but by walking, relentlessly, into death itself. Eventually, the march ended for most in Siberia's eastern towns. Survivors were skeletons of themselves. Some never spoke of what they endured. Others were haunted by memories of comrades left behind, of children frozen in blankets, of civilians abandoned to snowdrifts. The psychological scars outlasted the frostbite. The disaster had political consequences too. The White Movement was irreparably weakened in Siberia. Kolchak's capture and execution marked the near-total collapse of organized anti-Bolshevik resistance in the region. The Bolsheviks consolidated power, strengthened by both the retreat and the merciless winter that had done their work better than bullets or cannons ever could. The story of the Frozen March is not just one of numbers. It is a story of endurance and fragility. It is a reminder that history is shaped not only by wars and politics but by the environment, by nature, by circumstances beyond human control. It is the tale of those who tried to survive, who kept moving when everything in their body and mind screamed to stop. And it is a chilling lesson: ambition, pride, or leadership are meaningless against the forces of nature. A single step in the wrong place. A moment's hesitation. A thin layer of cloth in place of a boot. Each could mean death. And yet, for weeks, thousands moved forward. Step by step, breath by frozen breath. As we reflect on the Frozen March, I want to ask you, the viewer, what do you think caused this disaster? Was it purely the brutal Siberian winter? Poor leadership? Chaos from civil war? Or was it the combination of all these forces? Your insights and theories are important. Share them in the comments below. I read every one, and your perspective makes this archive richer, deeper, and more alive. If this story left you reflecting on the fragility and resilience of human life, if it drew you into history like you were walking with those soldiers through snow and despair, then please consider supporting True Event Archive. Subscribe to the channel for more epic historical storytelling. Hit the like button if this journey moved you. Share it with friends who love history told dramatically, emotionally, and with depth, and join our growing community of people who understand that the past is never truly gone, it's alive, and it's waiting to be explored. Because here, at True Event Archive, history is not just remembered, it's experienced. Until next time, stay curious, and never underestimate the power of the past.